This is a review of the 1963 John Cassavetes film A Child Is Waiting. This film stars Judy Garland and Burt Lancaster. I did not know that Judy Garland and Burt Lancaster appeared in the John Cassavetes film. To me, those actors and John Cassavetes seem like they belong to completely separate eras and traditions. Maybe a little bit of overlap for Burt Lancaster, but for Judy Garland, certainly I did not realize or expect that she would be in a film directed by John Cassavetes, but she is. It's an interesting movie, interesting for people who are just interested in those actors. Maybe I've already piqued your interest and you're going off to watch it. But if not, there are some more explicit reasons why you might want to learn about this movie or even check it out for yourself. There are some other actors in it too, some of the Cassavetes regulars, such as his wife, Gina Rowlands, Paul Stewart, and John Marley. They appeared in a bunch of Cassavetes movies. You've also got television actor Stephen Hill in an interesting role in this film, which we'll touch on a little bit more later. Brief summary, this movie mainly focuses on Judy Garland, who is a former musical scholar who wanted to become a professional piano player, but who has instead turned to sort of bit jobs and such. Now she's getting a job, seeking employment at a school for people with neurological sort of developmental disorders. This is people who are on the autism spectrum, for instance, kids. So this is a school for kids with developmental disorders. Burt Lancaster is the doctor, the psychologist who runs the school. Judy Garland goes to teach there, and it turns out there's a lot to learn about the best ways to do things. And there's a lot for the audience to learn, for a modern audience to learn about how things were done at the time and about the uncertainties and frailties, pitfalls of an approach that was still developing and that even now perhaps is fraught and not totally understood, but that especially in the early 60s had a lot of room to improve. To some degree, this film was a didactic plea. Its main downfall, people might criticize it for being too preachy, but to some extent, watching this movie now, looking back at it, gives us a slightly different angle on the movie that I will talk about more. First of all, though, I think one of the biggest questions about this movie is whether or not it's a John Cassavetes film, in the sense of the sort of the legendary later films. If you're curious about Cassavetes, I discussed him at fairly great length in my long video entitled My Thoughts on Love Actually, or something like that. I discuss, I think, 4 different John Cassavetes films, including A Woman Under the Influence, The Killing of a Chinese Bookie, Faces, and Opening Night. 4 phenomenal movies. I am a huge John Cassavetes fan, but before I even set out to watch this, it was fairly clear to me that this probably wouldn't be in exactly the same category as those films. This is earlier in Cassavetes' career, when he perhaps had less autonomy, and, you know, when the goals for what kind of movie to be made are somewhat straightforward. So this is a more mainstream film to some regards, but it's still a movie that's ahead of its time and different from a lot of the stuff that would have been happening in 1963. So while the French New Wave would have been fully in its stride by 1963, and we'd be having lots of interesting modern cinema in Europe, a lot of radical film wouldn't quite make it to the American mainstream until a bit later. If you look at things like Midnight Cowboy, or something like The Graduate, or Easy Rider, or Zabriskie Point, or anyway, you get the idea. All kinds of interesting sort of radical films inspired by this. I guess Antonioni's not American, so scratch out the last one. But all kinds of interesting, more radical films. Those would arrive more later in the 60s. In 1963, for the most part, Hollywood would still have sort of one foot in the classic Hollywood, been partly making very serious social realism films, such as the work of Stanley Kramer, Judgment at Nuremberg, came out, I think, in 1961, or there was A Long Day's Journey into Night, the adaptation of the Eugene O'Neill play starring Katharine Hepburn, and a bunch of other people. That's a really good movie, by the way, I think directed by Sidney Lumet. Anyway, point is, this movie isn't really in the serious social realism thing, despite it being sort of a slightly preachy, didactic, certainly a didactic film about a social problem to some extent, is how you could frame this. This movie is not very similar to those movies because of the stylistic differences. At the same time, this movie is not really very similar to Cassavetes' later work of sort of grating, hyper-realistic social dramas where grueling, intense, extremely personal scenes carry on for days, bearing the souls of the characters for all to see. This isn't that, but there is some uncertainty and there is some frailty in this film that I think can be traced to Cassavetes' later work. I would say, if anything, this movie seems to be hugely inspired by the 400 Blows. This is one of the earliest films of the French New Wave. You probably know it. Little boy having trouble fitting into the adolescent life, finding himself on the wrong side of the law. Even this movie, stylistically, seems kind of similar. A camera free to move just about anywhere, not locked down to a tripod like a lot of 50s films, but exploring the scenery, exploring the halls of the school. There's a couple shots that are filmed from the ground looking upward, so interesting style in this movie. And to some degree, some of the dramatic, some of the empathetic techniques of the 400 Blows are carried over into this film. So, is this a Cassavetes movie? I think I've sort of already answered the question here. You probably get the idea, but kind of. You can see that there's a inspired director here making something a little bit out of the ordinary, but he has not yet grown into the role that he would later have with a sort of very clear style and a very clear approach to making very grueling films. This isn't that. Okay. This movie has some interesting actors in it. This is what I led with. Who knew that these people showed up at the same time and at the same place? Burt Lancaster is actually slightly younger than people realize to some degree. Like, I think some people associate Burt Lancaster with the 40s, but he didn't really get into his stride in the 1940s. I think his first film was The Killers, which was sort of later in the 40s. And really, he came into it in the 50s and was still making films in the 70s. Such as 1900 came out in 1976. He's in that, the Bertolucci film, right? Or The Swimmer, I think, came out in the 70s at some point. I forget when exactly. That's another movie that I touch on in my Love Actually video. But Judy Garland, on the other hand, definitely is someone who's associated more with classic Hollywood. So in 1963, I think she would have been 31, and in 1969, Judy Garland died. In this film, you can see some of the effects of the lifestyle that she was leading, and it's kind of tough to see in some ways, but in some ways it sort of adds to the movie, which is kind of unfortunate. But as I mentioned, this is a character. Her character is someone who has sort of who is on a second life to some extent, who has tried to do this musical thing, has tried to pursue a musical career, and it didn't really pan out. And now she is looking for a place where she can care for people, essentially, looking for a place to make a difference and to build something, to do something that matters. And this is a striking role for Judy Garland to have at that time, and it's possible that the role was adapted for her, or it's possible that she was cast because of it. But either way, it's a good fit, despite perhaps being maybe even too real. You wonder if they're, if roles like this exploited her, some of the tragedies of her personal life. I don't know, but it is a I hesitate to even say good fit, but it is a fit of some sort. So Judy Garland in this movie is fairly striking. Burt Lancaster plays the character that Burt Lancaster plays in most of his movies, stoic and intense. In some movies, this is played straight, such as his early movie, The Killers, or The Train, great movie, where his stoicism and his intensity are a virtue. Those are the things that lead to success. They help his character solve all the problems and get the paintings across the border or whatever. But in other movies, those things are shown almost as faults to some extent. So The Swimmer, which I mentioned earlier, is a great example of this, where Burt Lancaster has this very stoic and intense visage, but as the movie continues on, you realize that perhaps he's not entirely in touch with the things that are going on around him. To some extent, maybe the stoicism has some sort of insecurity attached to it, some unfeeling nature to him. There's some sort of where something is amiss and he's not quite in touch with the real world. In this movie, basically the way it works is that his character is at times perhaps too unfeeling. One of the main dynamics that emerges in this film, which is a somewhat subtle dynamic, which I have to give credit to Cassavetes for. I think this is one of the strengths of the movie, is that for quite a while in the movie, there's a bit of a disagreement between Judy Garland's character and Burt Lancaster's character about exactly the right way to care for one of the children. Well, all of the children, but in particular one of them at this school. And essentially, Burt Lancaster comes across as being potentially a little bit unfeeling, and Judy Garland comes across as potentially being slightly naive. Both of them have certain frailties, where Burt Lancaster has a PhD or whatever, has experience, has wisdom, hypothetically, has worked with these kids a lot. Judy Garland seemingly has this intuition, this love for the kids, or whatever, this desire to care and to do things that seem fitting, and that seem like they make a lot of sense. So she becomes particularly attached to one child who was more or less abandoned by his parents at the school. His parents are in the film. It's Gina Rowlands and Stephen Hill. They play the boy's parents, who don't come to visit him. He's sad. He's lonely. Judy Garland wants to comfort him, wants to befriend him, and wants to invite the parents back. And Burt Lancaster isn't really in favor of any of these things. He suggests that showing too much attention to one student might turn other students against her, and that if the parents come, it might destabilize the student's existence at the school. It might develop a further dependence on his parents and such. And he sees that a visit should be sort of a reward for good behavior rather than something that is given when a student is struggling and not entirely conforming. I mentioned 400 Blows a little bit. So anyway, this is an interesting conflict in the movie because for a large part of the movie, it's not entirely clear which person is right. It's not entirely clear if the movie's going to take sides at all. Ultimately, it does. Ultimately, this movie does end up being somewhat didactic and somewhat preachy, and part of this is that it takes one side of this conflict. Now, you might not actually predict exactly which side, which is kind of nice. It was not clear to me which way things were going to go, or if it would go one way or another at all. It does go one way or another, but you might not exactly know which. For a large part in the movie, there's uncertainty about the best way to teach. This is one of the, I think, subtleties of the film, to some degree. A lot of people, maybe when they watch this movie, might pass it off as some sort of plea, as some sort of morality play, didacticism, being too preachy, being an awareness bulletin, a PSA about people with developmental disorders. And to some extent, it falls into that trap a little bit. But on the other hand, I think especially viewed now, there's a lot of other rich context in this. For one, it shows us that the methods maybe were not so advanced, and that for all the love that there was and all the commitment, people spending their lives, building their lives around these students, there were still uncertainties, frailties, and mistakes, right? Which is a pretty interesting idea. And we can actually take this a step further because there's a couple of sort of interesting anachronisms in this movie. For instance, the students in this film are referred to by Burt Lancaster, by just about everyone, by all the character faculty. They refer to them as retards, right? Which, is the word of the day or something, but there's no way that a modern audience watches this movie and doesn't react a little bit to that. I will say this movie has kids with actual developmental disorders are in the movie. And John Cassavetes does a remarkable job, for one, of getting this idea actually turned into reality, but also figuring out a way to work with what was likely a somewhat chaotic circumstances to really put these kids on a stage and let them speak and be in the movie in remarkably strong roles. You see that as a modern audience and you hear them described as retards. It grinds the gears a little bit, and it puts a bit of attention on this. Okay, this movie was a preachy film, a bit of a plea at the time, and yet there's some of these issues, right? The characters don't seem like they entirely know the best thing to do. There are also a couple moments of exhibitionism, perhaps, a couple of moments where the students are almost othered, right? They're almost treated as some sort of thing to distance yourself from, something scary, right? And for the most part, this is not the case that the movie's making at all. The movie is making a case that these students are to be loved or whatever, that the whole point of the movie is to talk about and expose, the difficulties they go through. And yet, there are just a few moments, particularly at the beginning of the film, when Judy Garland first visits, there's a few moments where the camera pans across the hall and you see these students' mouths agape. It's loud, it's chaotic, or whatever. And it just seems like there's a bit of an othering, a bit of distance to some degree. This, in combination with some of the language that's used, in combination with some of the other just sort of interesting anachronisms, and in combination with the intentional uncertainties, right? I think Cassavetes almost certainly designed the film so that this conflict between Judy Garland and Burt Lancaster would create much more depth to the movie. But all those things do sort of combine a little bit to make this seem like a very anachronistic movie. And like I said, that puts a bit of a backspin on the original goal of the movie, which was to be more or less preachy. To some degree, this recalls to me the movie Freaks from Todd Browning. This is from the 30s, which is a very interesting movie. This movie is mainly completely different from A Child Is Waiting. Freaks is a blatant exhibition of people at the fringes of society. These are people with abnormal physical presentations, circus at the time, freaks as they were known, in a sideshow, people with no arms and no legs or something like that. And the movie is provocative. It's deliberately others. It deliberately exhibits these people as freaks, right? As something that's sort of creepy to be stayed away from. And that was potentially disturbing at the time. But the thing that's really interesting about the movie is that now the movie is disturbing for a completely different reason, right? Back in the day, it was disturbing because these were presented as people to be afraid of, and people were afraid of them to some extent. Now, when you watch the movie, it's disturbing because we see that we presented these people as people to be afraid of. We are ashamed by our fears, disturbed by our fears, and the way that we provoked and stoked fears in mainstream films about other people, right? Yet at the same time, you watch the movie now, there's probably just a little bit of you that will be taken aback, that will have a second double take when seeing some of these characters and some of their physical presentations, right? So a really perplexing movie in how it was disturbing then and how it's disturbing now for a different reason. And to some degree, this movie is in sort of similar territory. It does play the exhibition thing a tiny bit. Not really. That's not where the heart of the movie is, but there's a couple places where it slips in, perhaps. Particularly, there's an interesting scene where they visit a place where older people, not children with developmental disorders, but children with developmental disorders who have grown up into adults, they visit some sort of asylum. And that's a pretty interesting moment as well that seems to lean slightly into this freaks dynamic. And this is kind of puzzling. In general, I think what you come away from this movie thinking is, well, conditions were tough. People were uncertain. There were real issues there. And in some ways, this makes it a pretty compelling historical document, I guess. I don't know. This movie has some complications to it in some ways. In some ways, you will be disturbed a little bit by watching this because of some of these anachronisms, because of the way things were back in the day. And perhaps that, outstrips the didactic nature of it. In some ways, it's kind of a balancing act between these really sort of interesting, subtle things going on and some not as interesting and not as subtle portions where the movie is more preachy and moralistic. Okay, well, there's still more to talk about. So, for one thing, this movie is surprisingly broad. I kind of thought that this would be basically a straight-up social drama about the people in the room, about the people at the school, and the relationships between the students, between the faculty and such. But the movie actually is more so a broad topical document about kids with developmental disorders. And at times, it really shifts away from the first category, from the social drama. There's parts of this movie have a narrator. One of the kids, the kid I mentioned before, whose parents sort of abandon him, or whatever. This is the opening scene of the film, which is a pretty compelling opening scene, a pretty good opening scene. This kid's life is described to the audience, narrated via his medical file. So Judy Garland goes to check out the file of this kid so she can learn more. And as she does this, there's narration and flashback that shows his early upbringing. And this is Gina Rowlands and Stephen Hiller, his parents here. In some ways, these sections actually remind me a lot of the film that I reviewed on this channel a number of months ago called Mandy, also known as A Crash of Silence, which is about a deaf child who's enrolled in some school that, speaking of anachronism, the school teaches the oral method, or oralism, which has been completely debunked and turns out is just a garbage way to teach the deaf. But there's a lot of the same dynamics here where the parents are ashamed. The parents are humiliated. They feel like they have done something wrong to raise a child that's defective, is a word that they use. Again, this is another moment where you have some of this, some of the anachronism here. Now, in general, the parents are sort of chided moralistically by the movie. They may come around. They may admit that they were wrong to some degree. They may come around a little bit to treating their child differently, but not entirely. And certainly looking back at that, seeing that that was one of the possibilities of ways that people would act towards their own children who were developmentally disabled, to be so ashamed to push them away so dramatically, that is certainly one of these anachronistic moments that you watch now and you are slightly disturbed by, that option was even on the table. Of course, a complicating factor of this is that now, I'm on my high horse for people who are... for our modern views of developmental disorder and how open-minded people might be towards children with developmental disorders. But the reality of it is that now most people have much more access to karyotyping, to early genomic or genetic analysis of their yet unborn children. Okay, your mileage may vary on what you think when you think birth is, but whatever. Children who are still in the womb or whatever. At very early stages of development, you may already know quite a bit about this, and you're probably not these days in for the sort of surprise that the characters in this film were, where they have a child they think is normal, and then they sort of begin to notice that the child is a somewhat slow learner. Like I said, somewhat similar scenes here to the interesting way that the family in Mandy comes to realize that their child can't hear anything. So like I said, I may be on my high horse here for how, we don't treat children with developmental disorders this way now. We're really open-minded. But at the same time, lots of families do probably deliberately avoid birthing children with such disorders. And we now have technology to do that to some extent. And maybe some people would react very similar to a surprise. I don't know. But the point is not to pontificate about this. The point is to talk about the movie. Either way, like I said, the fact that this was even on the board, that this was a conflict, something that could be contested, is another way in which the movie is an interesting historical piece. Another kind of interesting thing about this section is that, Stephen Hill was a television actor. He was in Mission Impossible. He was in the first season only, playing Daniel Briggs. He was replaced by Peter Graves for all the other seasons, partly because of, entirely because of religious issues. Interesting story. You should look it up if I've piqued your interest there, but I'm going to attempt to stay focused a little bit here. Like I said, there's narration for this part, and Stephen Hill, who's mainly a television actor, shows up, and it sort of starts to feel like a television show when you're talking about the early childhood of this character. But I think, there is, I don't know, there are ways in which, I talk about this as being a historical document, about revealing a lot about, like I said, basically what you come away with is that the despite how much love and how much care there may have been, the circumstances at the time were harsh. The methods were somewhat underdeveloped, or whatever, and that's kind of an interesting side spin to this movie. There are also fairly compelling didactic things for this movie. Look, the kid, we want his parents to come, stuff like that, right? So there's some of the sort of disturbing looking back at it is sort of balanced out with what people probably mainly saw at the time, which was that the movie was preachy and didactic. This movie was a big flop when it came out. I don't know exactly why. I don't know if people thought it was too preachy, or I don't know if people were afraid to go watch it, or if it struck too close to home, or if people were, again, trying to push these things away, keep the peripheries of society at the periphery, as people tend to do. Either way, on top of all of this, there are some moments in the film that are perhaps lasting questions. And I already mentioned a little bit how it's not even entirely clear to me if people today would be so much more enlightened if they were surprised by a child with a developmental disorder. Now, of course, there's a huge range of perhaps religious convictions about this, but the reactions in the film are perhaps not so alien to people today. And another thing that's pretty interesting about the movie, where this is absolutely not, like the film is a preachy, heartfelt movie about these things, but at the same time, it does surface some perspectives that are somewhat destabilizing and somewhat challenging, and it doesn't entirely quell them, and this is where Cassavetes shows through a little bit. And so one of the situations where this happens is when the school comes to be inspected, and this is by some sort of vague governmental organization, and this part of the movie is not really very fleshed out, but John Marley is one of these people. I don't know who the other actor is, but Two people come to visit the school. They see some of the classrooms. They're somewhat brusque, not very impressed. And when they go to meet with Burt Lancaster's character, the headmaster of the school, the doctor in charge, they ask him a lot of questions about the budget, right? They ask him, what is the likelihood that these people will go on to lead a normal life? What is the chance that they will be rehabilitated, brought back into society, and such? And they also ask him, why should we spend money here rather than on our programs to help the deaf or the blind or something along those lines? Now, these are somewhat tricky questions. These days, I think we're all kind of on the same page here about our moral duty to care for people with disabilities, people with developmental disorders. But at the same time, some of these questions are somewhat destabilizing, and they're not answered in the film. So I thought I'd put that out there, is that on top of all of the things that are in the movie, on top of the anachronisms and on top of the preachiness, there are also a couple of things that slip in here, which the movie doesn't. Well, Burt Lancaster has an answer for these things. But is it entirely compelling? Well, I don't know. You'll have to see. Like I said, my own moral perspective of this is obvious and such, but these are slightly destabilizing questions that are in the movie and aren't answered. That's the point. So overall, this film does have a fair amount of moving pieces to it. Is it a great movie to watch? Well, it's a pretty good movie to watch. It's got pretty innovative style. It's got an interesting cast. It's got an interesting subject. The use of actors, real people with developmental disorders, is compelling. And it's cool that the movie got made. It's cool that it exists. Could this movie have leaned more into Cassavetes type things? Yes. If you're a big fan of the Cassavetes, sort of the movies I described earlier, well, this is a bit different. But like I said, overall, a pretty interesting movie that does have some subtlety to it. It does have some uncertainty. It does have some frailty. It does have some anachronism that shift the way you might view the film today. And finally, it has some interesting questions about it, and some uncertainties that maybe still would resonate with some people. Even today, it's not clear to me that everyone does entirely embrace the care for these types of students. Maybe some people still would want to push away these kids, and some of the questions in the movie do linger to that extent. So potentially a powerful movie even for today. But like I said, a bit more subtle than you might initially think if you just view this as sort of a preachy film. So that is A Child is Waiting, the 1963 John Cassavetes movie. Like I said, a pretty good movie. I think worth watching, with an interesting array of actors, an ambitious sort of production, and more subtlety than you might expect.